here's the outline for the morning talk. This should look familiar. This is the top half of the ecology outline. The sort of lower end of the organization spectrum, the individuals and the populations. And I will stop here to give credit where it's due. A lot of these diagrams are from this ecology textbook, From Individuals to Ecosystems, which had the courtesy to put it all online as nice high resolution images. And so I have stolen rather a lot of it. All right, so let's get into it. First things, modular organisms. That is not a term that is used in general conversation, but it is a term of art. And what is it? A unitary organism is you and I. That's the higher animals. And in a unitary organism, that's a mammal or a bird, an insect, or a cat who is trying to eat my computer. Hi, kitty. They have a predictable, they have a determinate form. This cat has one tail. It's only going to have one tail, no matter how long it lives. It's not going to grow a second one. And any of us can die, but as long as we survive, that we're going to go through a fairly predictable series of stages. As we are young, we grow old, and we die. But for modular organisms, things are different. And so modular organisms are things like this duckweed here, things that they grow, they fall to pieces. These things like the hydra, where it's branching out and it's got these individuals on stalks. It's something like a plant where the relevant unit is branches, or something like a coral where the relevant unit is these colonies. And this does not necessarily have to senesce or die, because the relevant unit is these modules. And so the way to think about this, you can imagine a meadow. You got your herd of sheep in the meadow, and you want to know how long do they get to stay there? When is the meadow going to be depleted? So to do that, you would literally count sheep, because sheep are unitary organisms, and each one needs a predictable amount of fodder per day, and you can just multiply. But the grass is a modular organism. If you're a hungry sheep, you don't care how many individual breeding units of fodder are out there. You know, how many genetically distinct individuals are in that mass of green doesn't matter. What matters is the biomass. You know, how many blades of grass are in this area. And so when you were doing ecology, you treat these things differently. You have to think about them in terms of biomass rather than individuals. And so that's a distinction that comes up. And so population of structure. One way they can have structure is spatial structure. You saw those sheep, they are kind of clumpy-ish, might be random, but it might also be tighter than random. And tighter than random has its advantages. You also see sometimes you'll see this regular distribution. That is usually what that signifies is that these animals are resource constrained somehow, or they're defending their territory. So we got penguins that are defending their nesting sites. They're a peck away from their buddies. And this is a regular distribution. And you'll also see that where maybe there's water constraint where a plant that grows, that tries to sprout next to an established creosote bush just will not get enough water to survive. And so you end up with this grid in the desert of mature trees where nothing can survive in between. So that's a signal for some sort of constraint. But if you see the opposite, the aggregation, that is often some sort of safety in numbers phenomenon. And here's a story. Here's some actual data. So what does group living do to the chance of survival in this small bird? And so, as you might imagine, a large chirping group is going to be very tempting to a predator, to a hawk or something like that. It's just more noticeable. And you see that backed up in the data. You sit there and watch. The larger the group, the more likely it is to attract the attention of a predator. However, because there are more, the probability that that predator zeroes in on any individual bird is lower. So the probability of any individual actually being attacked goes way down, because don't have to outrun the hawk, you just have to outrun your buddies. And so these birds like to flock together, as you might see, because that's just what the fitness curve said to do. All right, so populations can have age structure. You've seen these. These are rarely an IBO goes by where there is not this somewhere in there. But I do want to kind of push you to think about, well, okay, these are the stereotyped curves. What actually are they? What is this? Think about this for a second. So what does this look like in reality? Let's back this up. So here is real data on this yellow-bellied marmot. It's a type 2. So its mortality is relatively independent of age. And what it's doing is, if you plot the actual survivorship as a function of time, you get this exponential looking curve. You have to look fairly carefully at it to say, okay, this marmot has somewhat less than a 50% mortality. So each year, the population is being halved, or a little bit less than halved. And it's hard to look at the belly of this curve and say, is this, how deep is this bend? Is it that way? Is it that way? It is a lot easier to tell what's going on if you transform this into a log scale. And so this 50% mortality represents a constant step, and you'll get this line. And so that's what's actually going on. It's hard to see directly from the survivorship curve, and this is really a log in the characteristic graphs. And you should be able to convert these representations just by, this is where the logic problem comes in with ecology. Here's something from IBO 2011. What does the mortality curve look like? Okay. I can give you a minute.
For type for 2 is constant, and then for type 3 3, most of them die off young, and then like if you survive to adulthood, you're pretty much guaranteed one day. And then for 1, like basically no one dies until they're very old.
Are you talking to her?
Yeah, we're answering in chat, but we're discussing.
Okay.
Yep. Yep. There we go. Actually, there you go. Here's what these look like. That was D. So type 2 is the easy one. It's a constant risk of mortality. That's straight across. And that was in all of them. Or most of them, unless you weren't paying attention to the question. Yeah. But so type 3. Yeah, so type 3 has this exponential decay curve, and it looks like that in the mortality rate as well. It has a high mortality at the beginning, but as you go on, the mortality rate goes down. And type 1, this is the human, or it lives for a while, and then at the end of its life, it goes through senescence, and then the mortality rate spikes. And then you're seeing that in this diagram where it's chugging along at a low mortality rate and it gradually goes up and spikes. And so that was, I believe that was D. One over here. It's low for a while and then it goes up. And then your live fast, it's high at the beginning and it gradually decays. So the difference is this this type 3 survivorship curve. And the mortality rate doesn't stay up like that. It doesn't crash at the end. Actually, it's highest at the very beginning and it quickly decays. All right, so types of measurements that you might see out in the wild. These studies are cohort studies, where a cohort study will take all individuals that were born in a certain time frame, and then it will follow them over time. And that tends to work well for things like, little rodents, where they are fairly short-lived, and you can come back for 4 or 5 years during your PhD, and you've tagged your little rodents, and you can see how many of them are still here. It works less well with things that you can't experimentally manipulate. Maybe you're working with dinosaur fossils, and you have no way of stratifying them by the very specific time. Maybe you're dealing with a long-lived population, dealing with humans, you're dealing with redwood trees. And so you have to take the static slice. So that's the terminology you'll see. You'll get these kinds of measurements of population size structure. Here is happens to be a plant, and so all they did was they went and looked at the plants and how tall are they and are they reproducing. And this is just your population histogram, and this looks relatively stable. You have a good distribution of juveniles through adults, and then it has to be about 0.5 meter tall before it reliably reproduces. for this plant. So this is a typical static measurement that you'll see. Here's something more complicated. This is a static age structure. And I'll read this to you. All right, so I've censored these, so I want you to think about it. Okay, so this is a plant. It's a fast-living plant. And you want to see the effect of nitrogen availability. This blue is low nitrogen, this red is high nitrogen. And so here's your static age structure, the age of these leaves in the low nitrogen case and the high nitrogen case. And you can see over time, this is number of leaves, live leaves per plant, this is number of dead leaves. And so in the case where you have high nitrogen, you have more and more, you have more leaves in the high nitrogen case. Just putting out leaves at a higher rate. But you also have this increased population of dead leaves. And so that's what this does to the static age structure of the population. And so think about this. What is this doing to the birth and the death rate of the leaves? The birth rate going up? Is the death rate going up, or the other way around? I'll give you a minute to think about that. Yep. Yeah. All right. It's been called. All right. So yeah, it's increasing both the birth and the death rate. Oh, there it goes. And you can see that looking up at this high end in the low nitrogen case, you just have more density up here in the elderly leaf cohort than you do down here. And that's true even though there's objectively more going in. So if you normalize this by, if you made this percentage, it would be even more obvious. So these are dying faster. They are not surviving past this 160-day mark, whereas over here they're lasting to 190. But you're obviously making more because you end up with more leaves per plant. So that's just some practice interpreting these sorts of diagrams. All right, next, population dynamics. So I think we're familiar with the life history of a unitary organism. You'll have this sort of thing. You'll have a juvenile phase. You'll have this time where they're reproductively active, and maybe this is optional. That will come to an end in Nilsson-S. You get these characteristic life histories. And these can have different characteristics. And something that you'll see a lot is this distinction between, goes by different names, goes by, you got the R versus K selection, you've got simiparis, it's all one breeding, versus iteroparis, where the breeding is spread out over time. And these are different life histories. And it's important to note that just because you're simiparis doesn't mean you're short-lived. You can get this sort of big bang reproduction, things like the agave, the century plant, where it can sit there for decades, storing up water and energy. It yeah, it is, you're right, it is a serious oversimplification. It is, you should know about it, and you should know what sorts of characteristics are associated with it. Fast versus slow is still, I mean, it's still kind of an unobservable fact. It's not the case that you can bisect it. It's not, it's not like there are two strict categories. There's some room in between, but there are some stereotypical. You should be aware of what the stereotypical, like the far extremes, the classic traits are, and be aware that is that is a thing that is going on. That was semi-coherent. All models are wrong, some models are useful. And it is still a useful model, even though it is wrong. Okay, so just because you like to get all your reproduction done in a big bang and throw all of your resources at it does not mean you're short-lived. And also, because you are spreading your reproduction out over time does not necessarily mean you are long-lived. And you could also have bursts of seasonal reproduction. The idea is that you are not putting all of your literal or metaphorical eggs in one basket. You are iterating, iter pares. And so this is what I was mentioning, the stereotypical traits of a fast or an R-selected population versus a slow K-selected population. This is quite classic. You have the live fast strategy where you have many low investment offspring. They're independent early. They die a lot, whereas the slow livers take their time, have a higher investment in higher fitness offspring. And this tends to make more sense in cases where it's a long lifespan, it's a stable environment. And what counts is being able to outcompete rather than take advantage of the abundant resources before somebody else does. And so why would you have these different life histories? And so here's a way to think about what's going on. In cases where you have a live fast strategy, you tend to have this sort of this caved in curve of where the first offspring is a relatively high cost. If you're going to breed at all, you have already taken a lot of the damage from that first few offspring. So the fitness says, if I'm going to breed at all, I might as well throw everything I have at it, because those last few offspring are what's going to get me the greatest increase in fitness. The more offspring I can have, the more each one increases my fitness. And so if you are looking for the evolutionary optimal solution in an environment that works like this, or it just happens that any reproduction at all will pose a high cost, the highest fitness solution is to just throw everything at it, leave nothing behind. Now, the salmon strategy, where you commit to being eaten by a bear at the end, but you do all of your reproduction in one go. And the living slow strategy, you don't invoke as much cost for the first reproductive event. And so it's these first few that give you the most bang for your buck. And so you can put out a few at a time, and you can look at what is your optimal place on the fitness curve. How do you get the most offspring possible out of that? And it's often somewhere here in the middle, where you have not fully dropped off the cliff, where each offspring costs you more and doesn't have a very good chance of survival. And you're really not all the way up here, where you're just not putting in as much as you could. You end up with this midpoint optimum, and that's the living slow K-selected strategy. So that's one way to think about it. Perhaps a more traditional way is, where are you on the growth curve? And so you have different phases of growth. When you're early on in exploiting a resource, you have no constraints. There's infinite food, there's infinite space. And so your growth rate, your growth potential is only limited by how many breeding critters you have here and how fast you can go. That's your R, where that comes from. And so it makes a lot of sense to throw a lot of low investment offspring out there and let them do their thing. Whereas if you are close to this carrying capacity, this K, there is a balance, and it becomes a lot more important that you invest in your offspring and you equip them to outcompete the others, because this is in the zero sum sort of range, where if you get your territory, you got to muscle somebody else out of it. And so that is something that favors the live slow strategy. You see this sort of S curve in nature. Here's some real examples. It's a bacterial culture growing a nutrient broth. The shoots of a salt marsh plant. This is what happened to willow trees after in a plot of land where the rabbits were removed. They could no longer graze on it. So this is a fairly consistent pattern. You'll have exponential growth until you exhaust the resources, and then you'll hit carrying capacity and level out, or at least not decline. And so what's going on, a lot of ecology is finding the optimal balance point between two curves. So you'll have, this is different. You have here's your density plot. Over here in your dotted line, that's number of births. And so again, exponential growth, and then it starts to level out as you approach carrying capacity. And you'll also get, as density increases, you get a density dependent increase in mortality. At first, there's more here to die, so it's fairly constant, but then competition starts to kick in. And then the weaker members of that population are outcompeted. And at some point, you are going to hit this stable equilibrium where birth equals deaths, and net recruitment is zero. And so this difference between the curves, that's net recruitment. Here you can see it plotted out over here in B. it keeps going up in a straight line, and all of a sudden, nope. And if you plot this out in the more conventional way, population size versus time, you can see this skipping along here. This is underneath here. This is the classic sigmoid curve. All right. So I had a cool story that I learned from reading old IBOs. I hadn't heard this one before, but this is a well-disguised life strategy question. And so it's a bit of a novel. You can read it. Okay, so you're comparing closely related bird species. Mortality of breeding individuals appears to be higher for species in temperate regions than in tropical regions. So predation risks to the parents and to the young and to the eggs are given different priorities in the different regions. And in the experiment, there are specimens of 3 different predators placed close to the nest during the day in the breeding period. And so the 3 different predators are crows, which eat the young and the eggs. There are owls, which are nocturnal, and hawks are diurnal predators. They eat the adults. And so how do you expect these different closely related birds to react? And you have a tropical bird where you can expect 90% of your clutches to move on and become adults. And you have the temperate birds where it's below 50%.
If you're in the tropical region, like as an adult, you're less likely to die anyway. So if you risk feeding your young with a hawk there, you might not live to reproduce in the future. But if you're in a temperate region, you might die next cycle to things other than the hawk. So you might as well risk it and make sure that at least this batch survives.
Yeah. That's what's going on. And so the tropical bird is more iteroparous. It expects to live for more seasons, and so it considers itself more important because if it gets itself eaten by a hawk doing something stupid, then it is losing more of its reproductive fitness by doing so. Whereas in the temperate bird, it's already done much of the reproduction it can do. It might die of something else before it gets a chance to try again. And so from the evolution perspective, it itself is less important. It wants to try to protect its clutch even at risk to itself. Whereas the tropical bird says, I can try again. The tropical bird's own life is more important to it evolutionarily because it has more of its reproductive potential left to go. But it's backed up by the data. It's also B. B is, this is one of those multiple answer ones. But not only is does the tropical bird put a higher value on itself, it also invokes a lower cost for trying to support its young. So even if, okay, this particular clutch is probably doomed, there are crows hanging around. I think there's a pretty good chance this will get eaten. But it's the tropics, the living is easy. I don't have to work that hard in order to support my young. And so it still makes sense to invest that relatively lower effort to try to support these young, even though they're at risk. Whereas the temperate birds that really have to scrounge for every caterpillar say, okay, I give up. I should not be putting good caterpillars after bad. And so the data backs up that the tropical species ignore the crow and they keep on going because it is a lower cost to them, and because they do expect most of these chicks to live, it's a better investment for their easily captured food, and so it is worth it for them to keep doing it. Does that make sense? Water break. All right. Next topic. And so we have these nice population models. Something to keep in mind that real populations are dynamic. These sort of a continuous differential equation sort of things. They don't reflect everything that is happening, especially in small populations. So here you see a stochastic model of population size over time. And this is really small population, carrying capacity 25, where each individual really does matter. The random chance of birth and death. If this were 25 million, you would never see this. At least not from this sort of randomness. It would be something systematic, like there was a freeze or something. But if you do have these tiny populations, every individual matters. You can get stochastic effects. And so you'll see in small populations and fragmented populations that they go extinct and they return all the time. And that is something that becomes important in the concept of metapopulations, where these are creatures that rely on this very specific habitat, fragmented habitat, small patches, and you have a greater population that is stable. And so you can say, okay, here's this butterfly, not necessarily endangered. However, as just part of the normal dynamics of this population, it will colonize these patches of habitat, and then it'll go extinct and it'll return. And that is just what happens when you're dealing with a little patch that can only support a dozen caterpillars. And of course, if you have this nice big habitat, the bigger the patches of habitat, the less it's subject to stochastic effects. These bigger patches here are stable. They had the butterflies there in both times they checked on it. Whereas in this more fragmented habitat, you had more of these colonization events, but also more extinction events where the individual patches used to support butterflies and no longer do. And the saving grace is that these stochastic effects, they are stochastic. If these fluctuations were correlated, there's some ecological catastrophe or whatever, then you might lose the entire metapopulation. But while these extinctions are going on, more colonization events are occurring, so it balances out. And so in a healthy metapopulation, you will still have your occupied patches, even though which patches are occupied rotates. There's that. Something else to keep in mind, that these metapopulations depend on dispersal, and dispersal, particularly in these sort of metapopulation patchy species, that is selected for. These species definitely want to disperse, and so here's some immigration behavior, active immigration behavior in the spider. And this particular spider is one of those that can make a parachute for itself. So it spins some thread out into the air, and that the air will carry it away. That is already an active behavior. You can see in this particular study, they looked at the density of spiders on a particular launching platform, and so the more spiders were there, the more other spiders were there, the more likely any individual spider was to try to climb up on a stick to get up into the air a little bit better. The more likely it was, it kind of tries to stand on its tiptoes to put itself more in the airstream. The more it was doing that, and the further away it ended up going. And so this is, this is not chance. This is not being swept away. I mean, yeah, they do, but they can, they can go flat mode, or they can go tiptoe mode. So that's one example of an active behavior. Here's another example. In this wasp, have this fairly dispersive, long-winged form of this wasp, and it has an alternate morph, this short wing form, and as the clutches get bigger, the how many eggs it's being incubated with, the more crowded these hatcheries are, the more likely this wasp is to hatch as this long-winged form that can fly away. So this is obviously, again, baked into the genetics. And so dispersal is not just a happy accident. And so here's a convenient place to put island biogeography, which is another greatest hit of questions. It's graphic and it's pretty. And it's a cool experiment. This is a classic experiment. How does if you have your small island, or your island in general, it's a natural laboratory, how does it come to have its species? And how do you predict how many species are on it? And so obviously you have to get onto that island, and you have to survive. So this is your number of resident species on the x-axis, and a bunch of things change what the distribution is going to be. So one factor is how close is this island to the nearest source of immigrants. And so the closer island is going to have a higher immigration rate relative to the distant island. A small island is going to have a higher extinction rate, just because, again, it's a smaller population, it's subject to stochastic effects. smaller the population, the more likely it just is to have a bad year and blink out. And so the small island has a greater probability that an individual species will arrive every year relative to a large island. And so if you overlay these curves, you will end up with different stable points for the number of resident species you have available to you. And so if you have your distant island, relatively low immigration rate, a small island with a high extinction rate, where you get this overlap, that is your stable equilibrium for the number of resident species. So if you go below that, you are more likely to pick up a species you don't already have. If you go above that, you are now more likely, you are more likely to lose a species rather than gain. Then you return to your stable equilibrium. And so the distant and small has a lower equilibrium point than a close-in and large island. Yeah, because the extinction rate is lower and the immigration rate is higher, different stable point. All right, so island biogeography question. It was longer winded than this. You have your oceanic island, that's far, continental island near, all else being equal. Which of these would have more endemic species and which of these would have more species total? Yes. If you have your further out island, it is more likely to have speciated. It's not, it doesn't keep getting gene flow from the mainland as much, but since it is further out, it is less likely to pick up species that happen to exist on the mainland, so it would have fewer species total. All right, that was relatively quick. That is my morning session.
Can you suggest any questions they could work on? Problems?
And so one thing that I thought about getting into is basic game theory. That is a thing that can show up particularly in more modern exams. It's the same kind of it's the same kind of idea where you're trying to balance out multiple competing forces. And find your stable equilibrium. That is one thing you can look at. And I think old IBOs are a good resource for these sorts of questions. You do see a lot of these things again. Oh, optimal foraging theory. Yes, I can. Okay, it's been a long time. I can still do this stuff. Right, so this is one of those balance things again. If you are foraging in a site that is maybe not so great, you can expect to find so many units of food, or you can give up and you can wander away and try to find something else. And that wandering away also has a cost. While you are looking for an alternate food supply, you're not eating. And so you will find often that there's a balance, and in relatively rich conditions, your organism will stay put and it will stay in its patch, and it will try to consume all it can. But at some point, it will have a sufficiently low reward that it is more beneficial to take the risk of going somewhere else where there may not be any food at all, but on average, you are more likely to get a better result by going to a fresh patch, even though it's the higher variance play. And you'll also see this in food choice. So if there is a preferred and a non-preferred food source, in the case where food is abundant, an animal might bypass its less favored insects in order to eat only the things that that give it the most reward. So like if a bird has a choice of feeding its offspring with a caterpillar, it will ignore the little aphids and the mealybugs that it could also theoretically feed its offspring, because that's just a lot more work. So long as there are caterpillars available, it will ignore the aphids and such. However, in poor conditions where they're at risk of starving, it will take whatever it can find. It will start scooping up those little bugs that even though the caloric reward is lower for doing that.
Okay. Anything else that somebody has a question about? Thanks, Bella. Bella's our ecologist. Needless to say. Oh, here's a question.
Yeah.
IBL.
Yeah.
Never
Yeah.
mind.
Okay. So back to this one. Okay. So in the tropics, it is relatively lower cost and higher reward to tend to your offspring, even if those offspring have a decreased risk, have a decreased chance of survival. So there's a crow right next to your nest. You've chosen a poor nesting site, and so that is decreasing your estimate of how likely these chicks are to survive. And that is true for both the tropical and the temperate species. However, in the case of the tropical, the parents have to do relatively little work because food is abundant. And so they don't have to expose themselves to as much risk trying to scrounge up enough caterpillars for their hatchlings. They can get it relatively easily with low cost to them. And they also have a higher baseline belief that these chicks will survive, because in the tropics, it's something like 90% survival. And so each of these chicks is, 90% of an adult. They are more valuable than the chicks in the temperate region, which have a low chance of surviving, even if there's not a crow sitting there and looking at them like, what's for dinner? And so what is observed is that the parents in the temperate climates are more likely to give up. So that even though they are more R-selected, if you want to call it that, these chicks represent a greater fraction of their reproductive potential. The odds of them getting to adulthood is sufficiently low that it's not even worth the effort of trying to go back to the nest and protect them and keep feeding them. Okay. So in the tropics, both the adults and the offspring are more important. They represent a greater likelihood of contributing to the next generation. Whereas in the temperate climates, life is cheap. The parents don't necessarily care as much if they survive, and they are also less invested in an individual chick that is of low quality.